Hello, everybody. I am Lauren Lowery. Let's see if I can get over here. I am an ICF accredited life coach and a fellow AGS mom. So in this presentation here, we're going to talk about a few different things, about why so many of us feel mentally and physically and emotionally drained. I think that's something that we can all relate to, that it just kind of wears on us. And it's no matter how much sleep, no matter how much rest you get, you feel like you're just always exhausted. So we're going to talk about what is the real cause behind that, and then we're going to talk about how to have more energy and feel less overwhelmed by managing your child's care and just the day-to-day things that come with this life. And we're going to talk about why self-care is not the only answer, because I feel like sometimes it's the only answer we're given. So, but a little bit of background here. Let's see. So, my son Leo, a lot of you guys know him, I know in this room at least. He is 7 years old. He has TREX 1, type 1 AGS. And whenever we first got the diagnosis, it was very hard. Right? We were essentially in the genetics office, and after all this time of testing and poking and prodding and hospital visits, trying to figure out what was wrong, we got the call from the genetics team. They said, "We have an answer for you. Come in." So we went in. They handed us a paper that looked like it was printed off of Google and said, "He has this. Good luck." And we kind of just were like, well, what now? And they didn't really have an answer for us. They didn't give us any direction on how to do this job. So we felt really lost. How do you do this? How do you be an AGS parent? We had no direction. And from there, that was kind of the starting point of my journey on everything just changing. You know, I started to push away my friends and just kind of isolate myself. I felt very alone. I became really irritable and I was angry a lot. I, again, was exhausted all the time. I was throwing myself into researching all that I could about my child's new diagnosis. And even whenever it wasn't a new diagnosis, even years in, I was still researching. I would stay up really late at night with a glass of wine and a bowl of ice cream, and I would just search Google for anything that I could find that would help my child, because I just wanted what was best for him. And I felt like I was not able to give that to him, so I just kept looking and looking and looking. And what I didn't know at the time was that I was experiencing symptoms of living in a chronic state of survival mode. It all starts in our brains. And what that does not mean is it does not mean it's all in your head. But what it does mean is that it is actually something going on inside your mind, your brain, and the makeup and everything. So what is survival mode? So survival mode is our brain's response to stress. So this could be something like a large medical bill that you get in the mail, or it could be a tiger chasing you. But it is what sends your brain into a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And when we have that chronic, unresolved stress day after day, and it goes unmanaged, we remain in that constant state of survival mode. And our survival brains, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but that's your downstairs brain. Your survival brain doesn't know the difference between that large medical bill that you got that you were not expecting, or a tiger literally chasing you. Your survival brain thinks those are both life and death situations, and it treats them so. Now, there may be less adrenaline coming with the medical bill. It may cause more of like a freeze response, but it is still perceived in the same area of your brain as that stressful event. And some of the symptoms that you can experience with survival mode, which I just want to make a little note here, that survival mode is pretty much, if you're living in that long enough, that is what will eventually turn into burnout. So some of the signs and symptoms of survival mode really do cross over into burnout. You have things like anxiety. You will experience maybe anger or rage. You feel disconnected, just kind of like you're separate from everything. You may experience memory loss or brain fog. I personally remember the brain fog. I thought that I was experiencing kind of, the pregnancy brain or that postpartum, but then, 4 years postpartum, you probably shouldn't be experiencing brain fog anymore. You may be more irritable. There's a lot of avoidance of tasks, so procrastination. There's an impaired focus, so you kind of lose the ability to focus on things. You don't feel present. Overeating or drinking, so using things to avoid that negative feeling and to make yourself feel better. Overwhelm, impulsivity, a hard time making decisions, and of course the mental and physical exhaustion. And what this might look like for you in your own personal life, it could look different for everybody. Everybody's experience of survival mode is different. But it could be snapping or lashing out at your family, over something small. It could be zoning out and procrastinating, scrolling on social media for longer than you really ever intended, or watching Netflix, just kind of trying to numb out. It could be feeling anxious and regularly thinking of those worst-case scenarios on repeat, almost like a loop in your head. In survival mode, living in that chronic state of survival mode, it impacts not just our mental health. It impacts our physical health. It impacts our relationships, our marriages, our children, our careers, and therefore our finances. It impacts your life overall. And I like to tell the clients that I work with, I like to tell them this, to forgive themselves for the things they did when they were living in survival mode. Because the things that we do, the anger and the rage and fighting and all of that, or just kind of feeling disconnected from everybody, those are just symptoms. They're not character flaws or things that are wrong with you. They're just things that you're experiencing as a result of all this stress that's going on. But what can we do? How do we get out of that chronic state of survival mode? Because we can't get rid of the stress in our lives. Let's just admit it. We can't get rid of everything that we experience. We can't get rid of the grief that we feel over the life we expected. We can't get rid of the sadness that we may experience when we see kids that are typically developing, maybe in our kids' classrooms or things like that. But what we can do is we can help ourselves move from the downstairs brain to our upstairs brain. So our downstairs brain is our survival brain, like we said earlier. While the upstairs brain, our prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for your higher thinking. That is where you will have your problem solving, your emotional regulation, executive functioning, planning, all those kind of things. And when we're living in survival mode, we don't have access to those functions. And so, of course, if you aren't able to regulate your own emotions, of course you're going to lash out at your husband for leaving the toilet seat up. Or, of course, you're going to, avoid certain tasks because your brain just wants to not have that executive functioning because it's living in the downstairs portion. So how do we move from that downstairs brain back up to the upstairs? This is the part where people tell you, practice more self-care. But I personally hate the term self-care as a special needs parent because, no, we all need self-care. I'm not saying don't take care of yourself. I am a big advocate for it, but the term self-care itself has gotten skewed. The term self-care has become things that feel good, things that are temporary, bubble baths and pedicures. And those things are great, and those things do help. But in our lives, the reality is that we don't always have the means to take care of ourselves. Exercise is a great way to move your brain from survival mode, living in the downstairs, to the upstairs. That is a great way. But if you're in a hospital and your child's in the hospital for weeks, it is not always easy to slip out every day and go to the gym. So like I was saying, we don't have enough time for self-care a lot of times. It becomes more about what feels good instead of what our bodies actually need. So a good example of that is whenever self-care is just what feels good, like I said, bubble baths, pedicures, instead of maybe things like eating well, exercise. We don't always want to do those things, but those aren't what we typically think of when we think of self-care. But when we process the stress, it doesn't reduce the amount of stress that we experience. So that's the problem with self-care, is it doesn't reduce what we are essentially taking in on those things that we cannot get rid of. But there is a missing piece to the puzzle. So there is something else along with taking care of yourself that can really have a strong, lasting, positive impact on how you feel, and a really strong impact on just your day-to-day life, on all those things that survival mode is affecting. And that is getting rid of your survival mode beliefs. So survival mode beliefs are beliefs or thoughts that lead to chronic stress and living in a constant state of survival mode. So this is what I was meaning by it does start in our brains. Now, this isn't things that we make up. This is things that are unnecessary stress that we can eliminate in our own lives. So some common survival mode beliefs that I see quite a bit are things like, if I ask for help or admit that I'm struggling, they'll think I'm a bad mom. Or I'm not doing enough to help my child. If I say no to doing this intensive therapy, or fill in the blank to whatever that is, then my child will suffer. Doing something for myself is selfish. There are more important things that need to be done. And I just want to stop on that one real quick, because that is saying that you are less important than things like laundry, dishes, all those other things. You're putting yourself last whenever you have that belief. I shouldn't feel sad about my child's diagnosis. Other people have it worse. Thoughts like these do not serve us in any way. They just increase our stress. Other AGS families are doing more than we are. We should do the same to keep up. Kind of a keeping up with the Joneses mentality. So whenever we have these survival mode thoughts or beliefs, they can create feelings inside of us. So every thought we have creates a feeling, and create feelings of guilt and shame, of inadequacy, lack of confidence in our abilities to take care of our children and parent. And the survival mode beliefs can result in unrealistically high expectations that we should be doing all the things all the time, which can result in us overworking essentially. Unmeeting our personal needs, not meeting our personal needs. And all of those things, all of these right here on the screen, are what are leading to our additional chronic stress. But the good news is that our thoughts and beliefs are not facts. And we can actually retrain, you can rewire your brain to think differently, so that you do have less of that chronic stress and you experience less of those survival mode symptoms. So negativity bias. So our brains, they're hardwired to think negatively. It's called the negativity bias, and it is actually a survival mechanism. And it is something that our brains do to keep us safe. But what actually ends up happening is that when our thoughts are constantly leaning towards that negative side of everything, we actually end up creating more pain and more suffering for ourselves in our lives. With the negativity bias, we only see our own personal flaws. We believe that we aren't good enough. We dwell and obsess over something that someone said to us that we didn't like. We remember the bad days and the hard parts, but we tend to forget the good days and the happy moments, because our brains are just wired to only focus on the bad. It's nothing, again, it's not a character flaw or anything wrong with us. It is just a natural response but it is something that you can actually reprogram your brain to go away from the negative and more towards the positive. And these survival mode thoughts, they end up leaving us mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. Because again, you think that you need to do all the things all the time, and you think that you are not as important as everything on your to-do list. You end up draining yourself. So how can you start ditching these beliefs, shifting your mindset to get out of survival mode? And step 1, it's awareness. So whenever you become aware of the thoughts that are creating that additional stress, and you're understanding how they're impacting you, that is the first step towards being able to shift them. So this is the thought cycle right here. So in the thought cycle, essentially what it is we have a thought in our brain, just a sentence, it's not a fact, and then that thought creates a feeling. And from that feeling, all of our actions, inactions, behaviors are driven. And the accumulation of all those actions and inactions and behaviors gives us our results. So if you have the thought, I'm not doing enough to help my child, that might give you the feeling of guilt, right? Comes with that. And from that feeling of guilt, your brain actually wants to avoid any kind of negative emotion. So what it's going to do is it's going to tell you, oh, you know what? Let's just pick up our phone and scroll on social media for a minute. Let's turn on Facebook or whatever, Instagram. Let's turn on the Netflix. Let's do something to distract ourselves. Let's add something to that Amazon cart and get that dopamine hit from shopping. Anything to distract ourselves from feeling that guilt. And the results that we end up with is that we actually end up doing less from that thought, I'm not doing enough to help my child. Because our thoughts will always be the driving forces behind our actions or lack of actions, inactions, procrastination, right? When we feel guilty, we beat ourselves up. We tell ourselves that we aren't doing enough. Our brains perceive that stress, and it goes into, typically for guilt, it goes into a flight or a freeze mode. Makes you just clam up, run away, hide away. What do we do when we feel overwhelmed? You have all these things going on in your life. And this one is tricky because overwhelm is also a symptom of your chronic stress. So it's kind of a double whammy. So whenever we feel overwhelmed, it causes a freeze response. You sink into the couch. Try to forget that long to-do list you have by scrolling on Facebook. You avoid taking action because your brain has convinced you the task will take longer or more energy than you actually have. I don't know about you guys, but I know that if I have a basket of laundry to fold, I will always say that I don't have time to do it. And I timed myself one time, just for fun, to see if this was true. And it took me like 5 minutes to fold this whole basket of laundry that I could have swore would have took an hour, 2 hours, definitely. So our brains will always try to convince us that we don't have the time or the energy to do certain things. And overwhelm also activates that stress response, sends you into that survival mode, and it impairs your ability to problem solve. And we need that ability to problem solve in order to get everything done on our to-do list ultimately, right? You need that executive functioning ability to be able to tackle all of the things. So after you have awareness of your thoughts and you kind of start to see how they are playing out in your own life, step 2 is to start questioning those thoughts that are not serving you. Our brains love evidence. We love to be right. It's not just our brains. Like, we all love to be right because we are our brains, right? We unknowingly will look for the evidence that supports our current beliefs, while ignoring the evidence that contradicts it. Goes back to the negativity bias. Our brains want to only see the bad parts because it wants to look out for the things that could potentially harm us. That tiger, that large medical bill. So if we have the belief that we never have enough time, Our brains will actually take notice of all the times we are extra busy. It will remember the days when you were scrambling from appointment to appointment, you were trying to fit in the tube feedings in between, and you had phone calls going off, you had insurance calling you, you needed to respond to that email from CHOP. I don't know, maybe just me on that. But your brain will remember those days and just kind of conveniently forget the days where it's not like that, because those weren't as stressful, those weren't as impactful. Our brain says, not important. So in order to get rid of a thought or a belief that isn't serving us, we must first build a case against it by asking ourselves questions like, when is this thought maybe not true? What else might also be true? Is this 100% always true no matter what? And you ask yourself that for something like, I never have enough time. Is this 100% always true no matter what? No, it doesn't. And the more you can start proving to your brain, almost think of it like a court case. You have to build the case against your brain. And whenever you do that, the more and more you do it, and you poke holes in that story, the more you will be able to get rid of that belief, the more and more your brain will not fully believe it. But on that same note, shifting your mindset does not mean gaslighting yourself. It doesn't mean toxic positivity. Because if you are not ready to believe something, that doesn't mean anything bad, right? You don't want to force yourself to believe something you're not ready to believe. And shifting your mindset is not about just believing the complete opposite, you know? We're not here to say, oh, I have all the time in the world, life is grand, everything's perfect, because that doesn't work. It's about making just small little changes here and there in a way that feels good to yourself. You still want to validate how you feel and what you're experiencing. It's just about questioning and being curious. So, like I said, shifting your mindset and belief, it's a process. It happens in steps. You're not going to go from one extreme to the other. And you have to have a sense of curiosity and self-compassion while you're doing it. You can't beat yourself up for feeling a certain way. And the process of poking holes in your story and just really questioning and saying, okay, what else could be true here? How else could I see this? Is there another way of thinking about this? So with step 1, we became aware of our thoughts, right? We started to see how they were impacting us, how they were making us act and show up in our lives. Step 2, we started to kind of question that story and question whether we really fully wanted to believe that thought. And then step 3 is whenever we can really do the work of being intentional with our own thinking. We call this intentional thought creation. So with intentional thought creation, it sounds very woo-woo-y, right? It sounds very weird. But whenever you are able to get control of your own thinking, it really does give you a freedom that I can't even begin to describe, because you are able to impact how you feel and how you act, how you show up. And if you've ever wanted to hit a goal, this is how. Because it lets you overcome things that were always holding you back, like procrastination or maybe motivation, things like that. It all starts with how we are thinking about things. So you become the watcher of your own thoughts. We have things that come in and out of our brains all day long. A million different thoughts. I'm sure there's a number. I think it's like 40,000 thoughts a day. But we don't have to believe all of them. We can actually choose which ones we are going to give power to, which ones we are going to give attention to. You remember that thoughts are just sentences in your brain. They are not facts. And a great tool for this, a great, exercise, if you will, is to do what is called a brain dump or to journal. So this is where you just set a timer for 10 or 15 minutes and you write out everything in your brain. You just get all of your thoughts out of your brain and onto paper. And that will help you separate. You can actually reread that brain dump you just did. You can go through it, and you can highlight in yellow everything that is a thought. And the way you know it is a thought is, would this uphold in a court of law? If the answer is no, then it is a thought. Highlight all the thoughts in yellow and cross out all the facts or highlight them in a different color. And that will really help you start to see that my brain is just making things up, right? We just have this whole set of things going on that we can actually begin to control. So, and we can begin to replace the survival mode thoughts with new thoughts that are believable to you, but also serve you, that aren't causing you to take less action, aren't causing you to go without meeting your own personal needs. And the more that we do this intentional thought creation, the more natural and automatic it becomes. Now, this is something that it does take work. And at first, it feels very odd. And it's different than, mantras where you put something up there that, really inspirational quote. Because typically with those, you're not ready to believe them. You want something that is still. You need to meet yourself where you are with thoughts that feel good. And the more you practice those new thoughts, the more natural they become. And before you know it, all of a sudden, you don't have that original belief anymore. So let's go back to the one, I'm not doing enough to help my child. If you have that thought, you can replace it with an intentional thought, or actually a question for yourself. What is one small thing I can do this week that will help my child move closer to their goals? And let me go back real quick, because with the first thought, we talked about that earlier, creates a lot of inaction. Because our brain is saying, I have to do all the things, I'm not doing all the things, so I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough, I'm going to go hide away and do nothing. Right? Where the next one, it opens us up to curiosity. It's a question. It opens us up to just a small thing. Your brain is probably going to be like, oh yeah, I can do one small thing. That's easy. Okay. And is specific. What is one small thing that will help my child move closer to their goal? Rather than just all the things, maybe you aren't being specific to what really matters most. So the first thought makes our brain feel like it has to do all the things all at once. Well, the second thought, it releases that high expectation that we put on ourselves. It allows us to make incremental changes instead of no changes at all. And you may even find yourself, well, one small thing isn't enough. And you have to catch yourself and realize that's your brain doing its thing again, thinking that you aren't enough if you can't do all the things. But if you do one small thing is better than no things, and you have to kind of tell your brain that. People say I'm crazy. I sound like I'm talking to myself, but but the more survival mode thoughts that we can untangle and that we can switch out and you become aware of, the less stress that we experience. And whenever we experience less of that stress, the less time we will spend living in that chronic state of survival mode, and you will prevent burnout. The less time that we spend in survival mode means that we will have more physical and mental energy. It means that we will have more capacity to be present. And it means that we're more focused on the things that matter most to us and our families, our children. Because we can't eliminate the stress and the challenges that come with our lives, right? There are certain things that we will not be able to get rid of, and we wouldn't want to not feel certain things like sadness about our child being sick, right? We don't want to get rid of that kind of stress. That is human stress. That is part of the human experience. But what we can do is decide how we show up and how we respond to it. We can decide what is serving us and what isn't. All right, that is all I have for you guys. So, does anybody have any questions over this?
Do we have a hot mic? There we go. Lauren, if people want to talk to you more or if they want to learn more, how do they contact you?
Yeah, so I have several different ways that you can contact me. I actually have a weekly podcast that if you want more information on survival mode, on stress, on changing your mindset and shifting it, on really just life in general as a special needs parent, it is Overcome the Overwhelm. It is on Apple Podcast, iTunes, all the main podcast platforms. So that comes out every Thursday. And then if you want to reach out to me, go to LoweryLifeCoaching.com. That is my website, and I am, of course, on Instagram. So.
If nobody's...
Which one? Oh, the website? Yes, it is Lowery lifecoaching.com.
So we don't have any more questions on Zoom, so I'm going to ask you a couple,
Yeah.
Because I think that first 15 minutes just basically described the last couple of years of my life.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there was ever a moment in your experience that really put you over the edge and made you realize, like, I have to do something differently.
Oh, there was several moments. I do distinctly remember a time where, and this is really personal, but I'm pretty much an open book, but Leo had been in the hospital quite a bit. This is, in and out and everything, and it was really hard. He was still in that very irritable stage. And I realized that I was eating my feelings quite a bit. At the hospital, I was in the cafeteria at all times trying to make myself feel better. I was, after every appointment, I'm going to treat myself to some ice cream to make myself feel better. And really what I was doing was avoiding everything. I was avoiding paying certain bills because I just didn't want to open the envelope. I was avoiding answering phone calls or dealing with things because I just didn't have the capacity or the bandwidth to deal with it. And what really struck me, which, this isn't, a topic about weight loss or anything like that, but I realized that I had weighed more at that point, a couple years postpartum, than I did at 9 months pregnant. And I started thinking, like, what is going on here? And, started really digging into what, they say, oh, weight gain is caused by stress, and that is true, but really it's caused by the symptoms I was avoiding of stress and how I was avoiding them. So that was kind of the tipping point for me, was a lot of the avoidance and everything I was doing in that point. Yes?
Have you ever seen yourself or felt yourself go manic for a day and do everything and get everything clean and then that day's done and you go back to crawling in bed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some of that is a little bit human nature, right? We have to have a little bit of grace for ourselves on that because some days we do feel better than others. And actually, if you guys listen to the podcast, I have an episode where I talk about this. It's the spoons theory. And the spoons theory is what they use in a lot of different chronic illnesses. I believe it's mainly predominantly used within the autism community. But the spoons theory is how different days we have different energy amounts. You have more spoons on certain days than others. And I think that the same goes true for us. We can kind of borrow that from that community because there are certain days where our kids need our full, undivided 24 hours a day, 7 days a week attention, and other times where they maybe need less of our, attention. And we kind of have to decide, how many spoons do I have today to give, and be okay with that and plan accordingly for that.
Here we go. I'm going to share that I'm familiar with the spoons theory.
Yes.
Because, and I attribute it to the stress and anxiety of parenting a child with AGS. I developed psoriatic arthritis. It might have been something that would have happened anyway, but I think that it very much has to do, or it very much is a physical manifestation and consequence of, unrelenting stress, essentially. And I share that because I'm wondering, I know you've worked with other AGS families, and I wonder if there's any anecdotes you can share without giving away personal details or anything about the difficulties that they've faced and maybe the successes that they've had sort of reframing things for themselves.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, yes. And not even just AGS families, but I've worked with a lot of other, families of other diagnoses and things that are similar, things that are not similar, and some things that they've overcome, right? Is that what you were? Yeah, in ways that they've shifted. Some big ones are in their marriages. This is a kind of a common theme or in their relationships, even if they were not married, that whenever we are in that survival mode space, we're not able to be our best selves. And that's okay, but it does have an impact on our marriages. But whenever we start to kind of get out of that place and we feel more calm, we feel more present, we feel more just kind of a sense of peace, less overwhelmed, that will have a direct impact on your marriage. And there's a direct correlation, and it's something that kind of a funny thing that I have seen just time and time again, that whenever we start to shift ourselves away from thinking, I need to do all these things, and I'm not a good parent if I don't do all these things, or putting all that pressure, you also end up putting pressure on your spouse to do the same because they're not doing enough either, and it becomes this struggle. And whenever you just release those expectations, you both get to breathe. It's going to definitely impact both in a good way. Another thing that is probably a little bit more specific is I worked with a family. She was trying to get something approved it was a different state, so I'm not really sure, but like a certain type of like home therapy. And they kept denying it, but she really felt strongly that she needed this to be done for her family to thrive. And so in a coaching session, she was like, I have this coming up. I'm really stressed about it. Last time that I talked to them about this, it became this huge blow-up fight. It was awful, and we can't get it approved. So in that session, I will never forget this session. We talked about essentially going at it from a different way. And this is something that we're all told to, be the mama bear, fight for it, go in guns a-blazing. And we think that's what we're supposed to do. And it sometimes doesn't work that way, right? Sometimes you have to catch more flies with honey. And so what essentially we ended up doing was she came up with, some intentional thoughts that helped her go into it from a place of teamwork. I don't remember the exact thoughts specifically, but they were things that gave her feelings of love and connection to those people that kept denying her. And she came in it with more of like hey, how can we help my child more? What can we do? And they approved it. So, that was like a specific one that our thoughts really directly impact how we show up, the things that we say, how we say them, and the results that we get from that. Am I going to say that that's going to work all the time? No, but it does work. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, guys.